Hi everyone, how are you today? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Marion and we're going to be going over some more chapters of Wuthering Heights. And the reason I'm doing it this way is because there is a lot to cover in this book. I am now halfway through the book, but I want to take the review side of things a bit slower and really dig into some of the things I missed when I read it the first time at 12 or 13 years old. So today we'll be talking about chapters 5 through 9, picking up right where we left off last time. And I'll just start by kind of a quick plot recap here. So in chapters 5 through 9, we have, first of all, the death of old Mr. Earnshaw, the parent of Catherine and Hindley. So he passes away, obviously. Hindley being the oldest child, all the rights and things pass to him, and he immediately relegates Heathcliff to the position of servant and, um, removes the privileges that Heathcliff had as an adopted son. So, as I kind of alluded to in the previous episode, there's this kind of up and down in Heathcliff's fortunes, and it's sort of a Cinderella story, but if Cinderella kind of fell in and out of favor, if you will. Heathcliff, becomes a servant. Hindley had been at school, but he returns home from his education with a wife, Frances. We don't really get to know much about Frances. I found her a very interesting character in a way, because she's such a ghost in the story, almost literally, but she is this childlike, frail, pensive woman. Nellie describes her as thin, young, fresh complexioned, and half silly. And one of the interesting things about Frances, too, is she's a foreigner, but not a foreigner in the sense of from another country. She's just outside of Yorkshire, presumably. But she is considered different than everyone else. Not to the same degree Heathcliff is, of course, but there is some, I guess, a little bit of prejudice seeping in against Frances. Nonetheless, she's there, she's married. I think her childlike and frail personality, if you will, and even physical health, paired with this boorish Hindley, is a bit unsettling. I found that to be very unsettling, but it seems he does love her and dotes on her. So that kind of starts the breakdown of the family, which I'll return to a little bit later. But around about this time, Cathy and Heathcliff are exploring the neighborhood and they meet Edgar and Isabella Linton. These are their young neighbors, and I think they're all around, I want to say 12 or 13 years old around this time. Isabella and Edgar, these two young, rather spoiled children that live in this fancy house, Thrushcross Grange, and they're fighting over a little dog and have hurt it in the process. Now, the symbolism of the hurt dog is something that'll come back later in the book with other dogs in other situations. Emily Bronte, she really liked her animals. She loved dogs and birds and had several beloved pets. But again, this thing about the dog isn't just Emily's love of dogs. The dog actually does mean something, which we will see as the rest of the book unfolds. Now, similarly to the beginning of the book, where our narrator, that is not Nellie, but Mr. Lockwood, he's met with a pack of somewhat fierce dogs, Heathcliff's dogs. Well, Catherine gets attacked by the Lintons' bulldog. And so she and Heathcliff show up at the Lintons' house, and Cathy is, everyone fusses over her because she's hurt her ankle, the dog's bitten her ankle or something, and then they all reject Heathcliff, though, because Heathcliff they don't like his appearance, and he's cursing, and he doesn't get brought into the house. So this is a significant moment because they've met the Lintons, and Cathy, through her injury, gets taken into the family, and is at the Lintons' house for a whole month recuperating from this injury. And she doesn't return to Wuthering Heights until like 5 weeks later around Christmas time. And by this point, she has become so embedded in the Lintons' way of life that she is a bit of a different person. She dresses nicer, she does her hair nicely, she wears fine clothes, and has kind of put on this affectation when she comes back. So, as you can imagine, Heathcliff becomes terribly jealous of her situation and of Edgar, who is starting to take notice of Cathy. It's kind of implied there. And Heathcliff really starts to feel the differences between him and the others very acutely, and he actually laments his dark hair and his dark skin and wishes he had Edgar Linton's features and his prospects. And this is the point of the book where we get this very small but noticeable tenderness between him and Nellie. Nellie tries to encourage him. She says he's a very handsome boy and, tries to make him think, well, maybe he had noble ancestry or something because they don't know where he came from. And she tries to instill in him this idea that maybe, he shouldn't think of himself as less than the Lintons. But I think Heathcliff is kind of looking at the reality of the situation as he's experienced it and saying, well, I am treated different, and, noble ancestors or not, it doesn't really matter. They're treating me like garbage. So I really liked this scene. I think it showed, again, this bit of tenderness between them and this insecurity of Heathcliff and his own moment of self-reflection. That being said, we're not left long there. Things start to really escalate from here and deteriorate as well. Because as Catherine and Edgar grow closer together, there's more conflict. So at some point thereafter, Heathcliff gets taunted by Hindley, and Edgar's there, and Heathcliff turns on Edgar in a moment of violence. So Hindley goes and beats up Heathcliff and leaves him in his room. This is all on Christmas, by the way, when Catherine comes back from the Lintons. So just quite a dark scene for this festive occasion, religious occasion at that. And then shortly thereafter, Hindley's wife, Frances, dies after giving birth to their son, Hareton. And then Hareton, the baby, his father, as you can imagine, doesn't have any way with children or really care about his child that much. So he hands the child over to Nellie to raise, basically. So, with Mr. Earnshaw dead, Francis dead, Hindley in supreme control and having nobody to counterbalance him or any anyone to give love to, because he doesn't love anyone except himself and Francis. This is where Wuthering Heights, the house, the location, this community of people, is really taking its first steps downward in a direction I don't think it'll ever fully recover from. Because Hindley just gives up. He abandons all decency. He takes up a life of squalor and drunken violence. We see some scenes of this. I think one thing that interested me about the violence in this section of the book is there's so much more implied, but Emily picks a particular scene to be illustrative of it. But there's a lot of more depravity and stuff that's implied that she doesn't describe in detail, because she's not trying to be gratuitous. I think she's just trying to be illustrative, and it's very effective, I think. But as you can imagine, animosity between Hindley and Heathcliff increases, and the family grows more and more isolated because obviously nobody wants to visit them. The curate and the doctor don't enjoy visiting, and eventually they just try and stay away because Hindley keeps lashing out at them. I think the only people at this point who even bother to visit are the Lintons. So we'll get back to that in a bit more later. That's kind of like a whirlwind recap of these first chapters here from 5 through 9, and there's a bit more it will go into in a minute. But what I wanted to focus on here in this episode is whether Wuthering Heights is a romance or not. This has been very much discussed endlessly. I mean, you can find many blog posts and videos about it, I am sure. But I wanted to kind of give my own take on it because it's something I'm really interested in as somebody who, I like a good romance story, but I also like stories that aren't romances, that still feature very strong connections between people, that feature different types of love as well. So I was really curious if this book, if I would just agree with kind of this growing consensus that no, this is not a romance, it's more of a, just a story about obsession. So let's dig into that a bit. What is Heathcliff to Cathy? So I think it's in this is going to be in chapter 9 now, where she's contemplating marriage to Edgar Linton. Things have, some years have passed, obviously. So they're probably around like 16 or so now, and she's contemplating marriage to him because they're growing closer. He's extremely fond of her, for reasons we can get into later. But, she is seriously thinking about marrying Edgar. And I think that we can get into that. Actually, let me talk about Linton for a minute. I realize my notes here aren't quite in the order I thought they were. I actually do feel a bit sorry for Edgar, and I think it goes a bit back to that isolation I mentioned earlier, which is that, um, did he have other prospects? And so I've been reading this book with my husband, and he suggested that the Lintons are kind of a step above the Earnshaws in terms of social status, but they're not like so much higher that they have like maybe many other prospects. So it's kind of hard to say exactly whether Edgar could have found someone else more suitable. I'm sure if he had looked far and wide, he could have found somebody, but there's something to be said for the fact that they all live in close proximity, and he has this probably lengthy crush on her from when they were young, and is just really taken in by her attractiveness and her charisma. I think she has some kind of charisma. So I got to thinking quite a lot about the Lintons' own isolation and how it affected them. The fact that they're even associating with this family is remarkable. Um, but yeah, so she's contemplating marrying Linton. And the thing that really struck me about this passage was that the alternative that she comes up with to marrying Linton is to marry Heathcliff. So I want to read this bit here. This part is much quoted when people talk about this question. So she's talking to Nellie about her, options, if you will. She says, I was only going to say that heaven did not seem to be my home, and I broke my heart with weeping to come back to earth, and the angels were so angry that they flung me out into the middle of the heath on the top of Wuthering Heights, where I woke sobbing for joy. That will do to explain my secret, as well as the other. I've no more business to marry Edgar Linton than I have to be in heaven, and if the wicked man in there had not brought Heathcliff so low, I shouldn't have thought of it. It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now, so he shall never know how I love him, and that not because he's handsome, Nellie, but because he's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same, and Linton's is as different as a moonbeam from lightning or frost from fire. So, there's a lot going on in this one paragraph. Obviously, there's some spirituality mixed in. There's this putting Edgar on a pedestal of sorts, but also a distant pedestal where she just can't relate to him at all in the same way. It seems like, she doesn't seem to view Heathcliff like a brother. I mean, if she did, why would she be talking about marrying him? And I think that Heathcliff could never have really been a brother to her because he had always been othered by the family. Obviously, old Mr. Earnshaw, when he first adopted Heathcliff, he kind of viewed him as like a favorite son. But I think even in that way, Heathcliff was very othered, and obviously he is of a different race and background, and I think that he's just much more akin to Cathy's best friend than anything. I don't really feel like there's a brother-sister dynamic, not really, but she does identify with Heathcliff very strongly. But she talks about potentially marrying him, and I think that needs to be considered in this question of whether it's a romance or not. I kind of want to get into this next bit on the next page where she says, she's talking about being in love with Heathcliff. She says, I want to cheat my uncomfortable conscience and be convinced that Heathcliff has no notion of these things. He has not, has he? He does not know what being in love is? And she uses that phrase, in love. So she's not just talking about, like loving Heathcliff like a best brother or best friend alone, but she describes what she feels for him as being in love with him. Now we could argue about whether, she's using these terms in the way that they are meant to be used romantically. We could argue about whether somebody her age knows what it means to be in love. Obviously, that's all subject to interpretation. But just kind of taking things a little bit at face value here and just looking at the text, I think that she is looking at him in this romantic light and obviously connects with him on a much deeper level than mere eros, but I do think there is eros as well. And so she goes on and talks about how if she marries Linton, she can rescue Heathcliff, she can use Linton's money to help him. I think she feels like Hindley has ruined Heathcliff. I think that's the other piece of this, is that at one point maybe she'd been more sure about Heathcliff as a potential husband, but his feud with Hindley has grown to such an extent that they're both terribly, awfully violent to each other and to other people. Cathy is as well. Nellie implores Cathy to consider that if Cathy marries Linton, she will be cut off from Heathcliff, and Cathy, she disagrees. She says that, no, nothing can separate us. He'll still be in my life. Edgar's just got to accept this. And again, she reasserts that Heathcliff is part of her. She says, Nellie, I am Heathcliff. He's always, always in my mind, not as a pleasure, any more than I am always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being. So don't talk of our separation again. So again, thinking of herself as one with Heathcliff, but this oneness, especially if we're thinking about this Victorian context, it's very much associated with marriage and with romantic love. Of course, questions of identity as well. I guess I just want to point that out because I don't think it's quite such a simple thing to say whether Wuthering Heights is a romance or not. What is Cathy's choice really about then? Well, she's born into this dysfunctional, controlling, abusive, isolated, violent existence at Wuthering Heights. Elements of this, vary, but by the time Hindley takes over, it's certainly in full swing. And Heathcliff also becomes part of this cycle. So that's the one side. On the other side, her taste of life at the Lintons' house is one of privilege and manners and money, and this idea she might have a new family in Edgar and Isabella. So I think her two choices aren't just two men, but like two kinds of lives. Whether she stays in these cycles of abuse she's so familiar with, or whether she escapes into some kind of normality. But the problem is, and this becomes very quickly apparent, is that Cathy also contributes to the abuse. When Linton comes to visit her and actually to propose, he clashes with Heathcliff again. Cathy totally acts out. She pinches Nellie and shakes baby Hareton and even slaps Edgar in her rage. Which is, well, I was surprised. I think I'd forgotten that whole scene. I've forgotten a lot of the novel, but it was really quite shocking. But it kind of shows this environment is part of Cathy as well. She's part of the environment and she's contributing to it. So I want to just leave that there for now. I want to dig into this a lot more in a future episode when we get into the other chapters. But I think we need to think about the novel being about Cathy's choice between these two sides of herself fighting for supremacy. All right, so what does Cathy do? Well, in one of her fits of passion, she stands outside in a storm waiting for Heathcliff to come home because Heathcliff's run away. She catches a fever. The old Lintons come to visit her, the parents of Edgar and Isabella. And unfortunately, they also catch the fever that she has, and they die very quickly. I found this part of the story extremely unsettling. I think because it feels like such a footnote in the main narrative. But the fact that she, in her unadvised behavior, she inadvertently led to the death of the Linton family, parents. Granted, they obviously chose to visit her, but, that's just their kindness, right? They would visit her. It's just, it's kind of shocking, to be honest. But that's kind of the last of that generation, and then they're gone. So 3 years after they pass away, Cathy and Edgar marry. Heathcliff is still gone. Cathy takes Nellie with her to Thrushcross Grange to become part of the Linton family, and Nellie has to leave baby Hareton behind with Hindley, and Hindley, as you know, is still an awful tyrant. So I think that's the other death in this part of the narrative. Nellie's motherhood, if you will. Nellie never had children of her own, but Hareton was in so many ways her child because Hareton's mother didn't live very long and Nellie was responsible for raising little Hareton. And Cathy took that away too. Again, it wasn't like something she, chose to do, but it was a bit of collateral damage in everything that's going on here. So I'm going to leave that part of the plot there. And going back to our question, is Wuthering Heights a romance? I think Wuthering Heights is indeed a novel about obsession and identity and belonging or lack of belonging. But at the same time, you've got all these themes being represented in the powerful bond between Cathy and Heathcliff and the moors, the place itself. So the novel may not be a romance in the sense that Jane Austen's a romance, or, maybe something like Jane Eyre. Maybe not a romance in that sense. But I think Wuthering Heights is also not a romance. It's got this historical setting. It's got the Gothic elements to it. There's a lot of inspiration from Lord Byron. We'll get into that even more in the next bit. But the romantic elements, and I mean romantic lowercase r and uppercase r, they're going to escalate further in subsequent chapters. And Cathy's struggle with her identity will continue to take on very fascinating angles. So I think what I would say is, don't read the novel as a romance or a non-romance, but just a book that kind of defies categories. It does all of these things, but it doesn't do any of them exclusively. I think Emily Bronte seemed to realize that human experience is rarely something you can easily put into boxes. It's more of a cohesive whole that has always little threads, and we don't always understand them, and sometimes we will never understand them, or only much later in life. So I think rather than parsing the novel down into Greek categories of love, if you will, I think we need to look at it as a story about some very lonely children who have grown up in a very troubled household with little or no parenting. And Cathy's affections, her passions, and her spirituality even, they all bleed into each other. And, they also bleed into the lives of the people around her. And it just doesn't suit itself to categories at all, even though it has something of each of them. So yeah, I'm loving this novel. I have plenty to say about the next 5 chapters or so, but that'll be for another day. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.